You're listening to the Speaking Tongues podcast. I'm your host, El Charisse. Each week, I sit down to a conversation with multilinguals where we discuss and celebrate language, life, and culture through our own perspectives. Episode 117, Speaking Punjabi and Urdu. Hello, language lovers. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Speaking Tongues, the podcast in conversation with multilinguals. This week, I'm so happy to share this conversation with Khawar, the founder of Somos, about his heritage languages of Punjabi and Urdu. Now, Somos is a startup which provides affordable language education and supports language teachers by allowing them to earn a living from their wages. In this episode, Khawar tells us about his heritage and lineage from India through Kenya and into the UK. He talks about growing up hearing these two languages peppered with Swahili words. We talk about the relationships between Punjabi and Urdu spoken at home and how identity and language are affected in a country like England. He tells us about coming from a big family, his special connection with his grandmother, and he shares some of the lessons that he learned from her and tells us about their connection through food. We talk about the inspiration in building Somos and how reflecting on racial strife in London and his own heritage and community has impacted the work that he does now. Thank you, Khawar, for this terrific conversation and for sharing your story and culture with all of us. If you enjoy episodes of Speaking Tongues, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the Speaking Tongues podcast on Apple Podcasts, and like and subscribe on YouTube so that other language lovers like ourselves can find the show. Special shout out to Speaking Tongues' recent supporters and patrons, Heidi L, Linnea H, Pat N, and Yari A. If you've been a long-time listener of the show or even a recent listener, you can now pledge ongoing support for the show on buymeacoffee.com or on patreon.com. And as you know, I wrote a book. My food zine of international language and cuisine, Taste Buds Volume 1, is available now for purchase. Check social media for the sneak peek inside the book and make sure you purchase one for yourself and one for your friends. Links to all platforms are in the show notes. Okay, let's chat. Welcome back to another episode of Speaking Tongues. I am here today with Khawar. How are you today, Khawar?
I'm good. Thank you so much for inviting me. How are you?
I'm fantastic. I'm so excited to talk to you, and we have a lot to talk about.
Definitely.
Yeah. I like to start each episode with the same question, and that is, what is your first language, and which languages have you learned to speak?
Great question with a very complicated answer in my case.
Sure.
I spent most of my early years in West London in a very multicultural place called Southall. So my parents had split up when I was quite young, and so my mum moved in with my grandma or my nanny, and also my uncle, my mamu, his wife, my pupil Swina, and their children. And that combination meant really a lot of first languages. So my maternal side of my family came from Indian side of Punjab, but before coming to the UK, had done 2-3 generations in Kenya. So they brought with them Punjabi with some Swahili vocabulary. And also as they got to the UK and got to know, I guess, the Pakistani and Punjabi diaspora there, Urdu started coming in. And also a lot of my uncles, aunts, and my mum married Urdu speakers. So my dad's family was Urdu speaker. My pupil Smina that I was now living with also was an Urdu speaker. So in the house, we had all of these, and of course, English as well. I think also really for my uncle and my mum and her siblings, most of them were born in Nairobi, but had moved over to UK at an early stage. So I guess their Punjabi and their Urdu was a little bit different to their parents, and also had a lot more English and London references to it. So I had all those things to begin with, really, for my formative years. And then I moved to a really, really white English suburb called Staines, which you may have heard of because of Ali G.
Ali G.
Yeah, exactly. So we moved in with my stepdad then, Pete, and English really took over at home and in school as well. So I would say in terms of the language I can express myself most in terms of vocabulary and grammar, is probably English. But I think of Punjabi, Urdu, and those influences as probably my first and kind of heritage languages. And since then, I've learned quite a lot at school. I did Spanish, French, and German, and Spanish is really the one I've carried on. I move around a lot every few months, so I tend to try and learn the language of the country I visit. So that's meant very, very basic Montenegrin at one point. I'll be learning Malay soon, and I've tried other things so I can at least get by and be polite wherever I am.
Yeah, that's the way to be. That's how you be a global citizen, right? Like you,
Yeah, and it's cool, and it's a great way to learn a bit about culture and concepts as well, because outside just European languages is obviously just a different way of constructing things and thinking about things, and all these languages tell their own story as well. And I think it's just a great way of understanding someone.
yeah. Um, it's funny because when I asked you that question, my first question I ask everybody, and I I realize that some people have more quote complicated answers than others. And I always love that because it makes me realize how this question that looks really simple is really not simple for a lot of people. And that's what I want to emphasize with this show is that, we are talking about language, but for many of us, language and culture are inextricable. And even if you don't use the languages, your first quote languages, every day, they're a part of you. And
Absolutely.
yeah, and I want to emphasize that and I want people to just kind of realize that like nobody is less than or not enough of because they're not holding on to their heritage languages or languages that are a part of them. Like that's what makes us who we are, and I want to celebrate that. So I like your complicated answer. I appreciate your complicated answer. And the second part of what I wanted to say was it's only recently for me that I'm realizing this Indian diaspora in East Africa and how that had such an impact on generations of people. And I will say, growing up in the US and I'm in New York City, like I never learned this. I never learned about that. And, speaking with you and speaking to, several other, and actually many of the people that I've spoken with are English, British, or they grew up in the UK. So they
Yeah.
have this kind of connection to East Africa. And I think it's so fascinating. Like this is brand new for me. So it's like a lot that I have to educate myself on. But do you want to talk a little bit about just kind of how that influence of East Africa or, how that was carried on, with your family and whatever you feel comfortable about, discussing, but how that element of your family being in East Africa at this time, was translated another time into the UK.
So yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's again very complicated to pull apart. So I think the first thing to talk about there is British Empire and moving people around the empire where they felt they needed them. I think we've also got to look at Indian migration to Africa generally as well through a kind of class and hierarchical lens as well. Not all Indians were sent there for very good reasons, and it
Mm,
was part of playing a role in a kind of hierarchical racial structure.
mm,
And there's obviously a lot of anti-blackness built into that. And sadly, lots of Indian communities or Pakistani communities now have bought into that, not just in African jurisdictions, but also in the places that they've followed. So I think it's kind of important, firstly, to recognize that exists all within this sort of white supremacist structure of the British Empire. There's then the kind of more positive side of it, in that there's a connection between those of us that have been moved around different parts of the British Empire for different reasons, and what that means when you all end up in the same place. And I think, Southall, where I was, lucky to be for those 2 years, and when my siblings, so not my siblings, my uncles and aunts all grew up, and my grandparents moved to. Firstly, was known as Little Punjab because of all the Punjabis that went there,
I love
but
that.
also some of them had come via places like Singapore, depending on where they'd gone, say, for World War II. Others had come from places in Africa, but also there was, probably sort of 70s, 60s, 70s, a lot of Afro-Caribbean that's there as well. And also Irish people coming through who've all experienced the British Empire in very different ways. But then there's a lot in common between those diaspora communities too, in terms of fighting that, and in terms of engaging with how they were treated when they got to the UK.
Hmm.
So I think that's kind of the broader lens. And then the East Africa part is really interesting, I think, from a linguistic perspective as well, because my mum, for example, it was a revelation for her when I started learning Swahili that some of the words she considered Punjabi or Urdu were in fact Swahili,
Wow.
because her friends, who again were kind of once removed Punjabi, whether they were Sikh or Hindu in Southall, all use similar words because they'd all been through East Africa.
Mm.
Similarly, one of my best friends, Pritesh, got married last year, and I met him in Spain. He was like the other brown guy, and his family are Gujarati and came via Zambia. So I was kind of there while his uncles and aunts were all chatting in the kitchen or preparing for his wedding. And I didn't understand any Gujarati, but then suddenly these bits of Swahili used in the same context as my family would, and you're half in the conversation. And I thought that was just really fascinating, that we then sort of find these communities that are supposedly completely disparate have all gone through this kind of migratory experience.
Hmm.
And I find that really fascinating around language, but also around food as well, because I think my grandma, my nanny, and her friends, I remember they used to make cassava, they used to make mogo, and it's quite an East African dish and the way they did it. And later on in life, I've met other Pakistanis, and you kind of mention that to them, and they're like, what are you talking about?"
How
Um, so,
interesting.
I think you get these kinds of changes as well that come with it, and it's a really important lens, I think, to kind of connect us through, and I think particularly across cross-racial lines as well,
Right.
because someone who, let's say, come from a Caribbean island at the same sort of time, 60s and 70s, to the UK, is going to be having a similar set of experiences to someone coming from East Africa, and there is something to connect over there. It's not, of course, identical, but there's enough there, I think, for kind of solidarity conversations. And I think that was a huge part of the protest movement in Southall and places like Brixton, of course, in the sort of 70s as well.
Yeah. Tell me about growing up and, having all of these languages surrounding you. And maybe, again, just to be clear, you don't have to get super duper personal if any of this is, triggering, or if it's, if you don't want to share, you certainly don't have
Sure.
to. But um, I would love to know, growing up around all the languages that you've grown up around, and what was the attitude, or maybe the prevailing attitude, maybe not just in your family, but in your community, of encouraging kids your age to immerse them, or immersing kids in the language, or encouraging them to learn these languages as well? Like, was it welcomed? Was there an attitude of maybe, maybe not with your family, but was there any attitude of like, we're in England now and we have to learn English, or we have to speak English? Like, how did people feel about holding on to their languages, and passing them on to the next generation?
So I think the first thing to say is, if I go back to your first question, um, I'm answering that now as it's complicated, because as an adult, I've spent time digging into what's the relationship between the languages that I had at home. Why did that change? What does that mean for me and my identity? And the reality is, when I was younger, that was much simpler. It was Urdu at home, and there was English afterwards.
Okay.
And one represented one type of culture and one type of religion and one type of set of freedoms or restrictions, and one lifestyle represented the other. And I think as a young person, I kind of felt trapped to that. So I think definitely in my family, of course, there was, I think certainly my wider family, there's definitely an urge that we speak our languages. But also, like with a lot of migrant communities, there's also a expectation that you go get as educated as possible.
Okay.
And often what that means when you arrive is the host country's education, whatever they consider. So that is also doing well in those schools
Right.
and in those subjects and learning those languages. So I think that sort of one side of it that I definitely felt from my mum when we moved to Staines with my stepdad was, okay, you've now got these opportunities I never had.
Mm.
Go excel. And obviously, like that's coming from a place of love, but also it's like a real depressor as well. And then also you add in things of just being a teenager and wanting to fit in my environment, which is a very white one. I went to, I guess, what you call a public school in the States to begin with, and I was the first brown person in there, and I don't think I'd noticed I was brown before that. Like,
Mm.
if I'm being honest, like, I'd seen white people on TV and they seemed kind of cool and fun. And then, you know, someone said something to me pretty offensive in like my first week. And, it was this real reminder of difference. And I think whether consciously or subconsciously, I wanted to fit in. After that, I went to a private school. And again, to go with this like education piece, I was put in speech therapy.
Mm.
Now, I didn't have a stutter, I didn't stammer, I didn't have the speech issue. I just sounded like someone from Southall. Now, there's obviously like a class point on that, but there's a racial point on that. But I think collectively the mood was that's good because you're now moving in the direction of speaking the proper type of English, whatever that may mean to
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
And so I think these hierarchies are there when we're talking about like being educated. And that's what's often meant is trying to climb to this essentially quite white middle upper class status that everyone's trying to achieve. So I think there was an undertone of that, but at the same time, you shouldn't leave your culture behind. And I think where I'm definitely more forgiving of, the generation above me is that they obviously were going through their own identity stuff. Like I've no idea what it's like to go through busing or how, my mum used to say her brothers were let out of school 15 minutes early to avoid violence. Like, you know, so they could get on the bus. But, like these are in a very different thing. And you're in an environment where who had the time or the luxury to process that? So when it gets to their children, I think speaking to my mum, she was divorced, she married a white guy, she moved to the suburbs. She's got to deal with all of that. And I think for me in the house, that was channeled through, well, at least, pay attention to the religion and what you're meant to do there. And I
Yeah.
guess my rebellion at the time was, well, I'm going to reject that and everything to do with that in favor of this new world. And, if I had my world again, I would definitely wouldn't do that because I
Mm.
think obviously there's much more to culture than that. But I think my mum probably wasn't in a place to kind of tackle it differently either because there's so much to process for yourself.
Yeah.
Um, so I think there's kind of a lot there. And then when you start going to schools like that as well, again, there's this notion of language as utility. So what languages do they offer? The most common European one.
Right.
Your parents support you learning that because it's useful. So not that anyone did suggest it, but if someone had said, "Oh, why don't you just do a Punjabi qualification?" They would have been like, "What's the point?"
Mm.
Rather than, well, actually that means something in terms of your heritage. And I
Yeah.
think that's something where I feel like those kinds of discussions with younger generations are a bit healthier in terms of what languages can offer and what connection it can do, but also how we innovate them. Because
Mm.
also when I think back of my mum's, my mum's one of 10 siblings, one of 10
Wow.
children, and she's really close with two of her sisters, my colours, Mina and Gina. And when I think of childhood memories of them spending time together and really laughing, it's in this like garbled Urdu, Punjabi, English, and that's also like innovation in diaspora. And so, what if it's not proper in any of those languages?
Yeah.
Like, who cares? Like, it's where they've got to, and that's how they're sharing, family or community. And I think
Mhm.
that's like incredible. And actually, when you're part of a diaspora like that, you get to really lean into that kind of connection. And I'm so lucky I get to reflect on it now. I'm a bit older and a bit more grown up, and think of like the richness of that. Like
Yeah.
um, so that gets more, I guess, deep as you get older. And I feel
Yeah.
very lucky for that.
I have a really soft spot for cross-cultural uh families or like multi-generational that like are mixing language and mixing things here and there because I feel like I love my family, but we didn't
Yeah.
have that. Like, and as soon as you're saying, you're bringing up that memory, like even for me, observing your memory, I'm like, oh, that's such a warm memory. That's
Yeah.
like so beautiful and wow. And I think, what you're saying about making that move to Staines and how, your world changed and what you were exposed to changed. And at that age, it's normal. I think a lot of kids, like you said, like all kids want to fit in and,
Yeah.
fit into whatever that means. And there's a lot of things that I'm sure we'd all look back and do a little bit differently or we'd approach differently. And what do you think that looks like for you? Like, what would you do differently if you had a chance to? I mean, regarding the languages, that you
So
yeah.
a good question. And I explored this, my parents and I, me and my mum and stepdad, we had good chats over the last couple of years around race and language and how we sort of think about that richly. And I think as I've got older, there's so much I love in terms of learning around food, history, and just music, culture. So I think I would have liked to have more of that in the home. And there's also this sort of irony when you look back of when you're in that kind of environment and you're the migrant or
Mm,
the second generation or third generation migrant, whatever, you're trying to fit in with the white kids as much as possible.
mm.
But in a private school like that, they're doing their best to glean as much black culture as they possibly can so that they look cooler. That's that's the reality of what's happening, right? Like, and you just think how farcical it is, when you step back, um, of not have, of not like having that. I
Mhm.
think the other time I was, really, really lucky to have that relationship with my nanny where she basically raised me at the beginning. So, I'd speak to her a lot and, we'd connect. I think my sadness around it all is that, she died many years ago now, is that I would have loved to have these conversations with her
Mm.
in more in-depth kind of ways because she told me lots of stories and I learned loads hearing from her. But my side of it was always quite like functional and more enough to ask questions and enough to understand. But I
Mhm.
think you know I've got now an adult's understanding of these things and I've put more time into it. So I would have loved to have asked her more about her experiences migrating and living in three continents.
Yeah.
At a time when not everyone did that. So I think that that's something I would have loved to have done.
Yeah. Um, I miss my grandparents a lot, and I think that, like, I mean, I'm not trying to insert myself in your story. It's not about me.
It's okay.
But I'm asking this because like for me, like I will talk about my grandmothers forever. And I want to ask
Yeah.
if there's anything you want to say about Nani, about your grandmother, anything that she taught you, anything that you want to share with my listeners and just give her some love.
I'm very, very blessed that I've had a lot of people who've taken an interest in my life, my development, care, community, and but when I think of the first super important person, it's definitely my nanny, and she had 10 children, widowed at a very early age in the UK, and I think I've got something like 45, 50 cousins, and
Wow.
so many of us have done a stint living there at some point.
Hmm.
Um, but for me, I think it's kind of a weird thing to say, but CEO lessons, I've run businesses, and she taught me a lot about how to manage lots of people with different and conflicting needs.
Mm.
And she applied that, I think, very skillfully and diplomatically to a family with all sorts of things going on, different ethnicities, money issues, all those sorts of things. And just, with that amount of people, just being available. And she did that incredibly well. And the other thing I'm just super grateful for is that a lot of culturally, and certainly for my mum at the time, I think there was a lot of emphasis on patriarchal things. So when she got divorced, there was a lot of like, well, boy should be with his father and he should be, you
Mm.
know, exposed to that. My biological father was quite a difficult guy, and I, my mum was always insistent I had a relationship with him, and to the point I was getting like I didn't really want one, and my nanny was obviously, we talk about getting rid of toxic people and all that now. She was just like, you just cut that kind of thing out, and it
Mm.
was so simple, and she kind of cut through everything, all these confusing things. And I suppose that comes with experience, but I think sometimes I see all these like modern approaches to things like self care and things like that, and I think actually my nanny laid a really good framework for me in terms of who I keep in my life, why, and how I give them time and connect with them. And I think the other thing that's I think special for me is that I could always show up. I showed up to a house once with some friends from college, and food was just ready to go, and it was just always like that. So when I cook now, very much whatever I'm making, like I think about my grandmother's kitchen,
Mm.
and that's a real gift to be able to cook for people and kind of build that. And I think that very much comes from her, and my mum has that too as well. So that's
Yeah.
translated through, which has been really great.
I love that. We dedicate this episode to your grandmother. We
Oh,
love
thank
her.
you.
We love her. Um, that being said, and you did have this, the language, and speaking with her and primarily, and she raised you. I guess, talk to me about that. I'm asking this question because I know that with people who speak multiple languages or are learning multiple languages, have grown up around them, etc., there are feelings that become attached to certain, languages or certain ones that we speak. So, for you, having this connection to these languages that were so close to your family, what is that connection like? And especially if you've had to, um, speak to people outside of your family, outside of your community, in these languages, like what is the feeling that you have surrounding them, basically?
So there's two things.
Okay.
There's one, I guess, is like inner dialogue and what I hear, and that is warmth or sometimes. So we just got a rescue kitten. My mum and stepdad just got,
Oh.
and he fell over the other day, and my mum went hi, and I know she always does that, and that's sort of that syllable is just empathy or concern or something like that. And I hear that in other people or other people's, there's lots of other little words and expressions like that. And I hear that in other people, and that connects me immediately to those communities. I think the other thing is beyond not just my languages, but I think other people in the diaspora. And sometimes, so like two of my really close friends are Nigerian, Temi and Franco, and they've been brought up in or spent a lot of time in the UK. And although I don't speak any Yoruba and they don't speak any, there's sometimes we talk about cultural stuff and there's just that, you know what I mean. And I think it's really interesting sometimes when you kind of are in spaces with those kinds of people that have done similar things, that there's just this connection that goes beyond something.
Mm.
And I don't really know how to articulate it, but there's a feeling there that you're connected around something. I think that's really great. I think the other side of it is self-consciousness, because when I moved away, I was very conscious about sounding white when I spoke Punjabi or Urdu amongst uncles, aunts, cousins, and particularly if I felt ultra loaded because my mum had done this thing and married a white guy, and like
Mm.
so there's all this thing floating around. So I listened a lot, but I never really had the confidence to be. And when I did, it was other than my nanny, who I kind of did, and that was often one on one. With my wider group, my cousins, I always went for English.
Mm.
And I think that was to do with self consciousness, really. And it's been really interesting having conversations with other people who've had similar scenarios to me, who know what I'm talking about there, because they're like, well, yeah, actually, because there's always that, one uncle or one auntie that's like, you sound like a guy called Dave when you speak Punjabi.
Oh
Yeah.
no, no, Dave. Um, Now with Urdu and Punjabi, where are you? Are you actively, are you going back to the languages? Are you trying to learn them, or what do you feel? How do you feel about it?
um, so lots of different things. There's sometimes I yearn to hear it.
Mm.
So actually, the last few years, I've watched more things in like Urdu, certainly on Netflix, just because it's there and I can,
Yeah.
and it's really nice. And because I've been moving country to country the last sort of few months, it's been just lovely to hear, because there's sometimes you just hear it and it brings, and I've really reveled in that. I also, a few years ago, did start learning some of these languages online. So I did some Punjabi, I did some Urdu. My cousin and I made a trip to Kenya to explore where our family was from. So I
Yes.
learned some Swahili before going.
Okay.
And again, it was just nice to kind of connect these things. I think the other thing that's come with it, and again, looking back to my kind of grandparents' generation, is realizing how translingual they were.
Mm.
Because now, if I watch something in Hindi, well, I understand most of it, and I wouldn't have realized that probably when I was younger, that they're
Mm.
quite similar to Urdu.
Mm-hmm.
I went to Mumbai with, my friend Ritesh that I mentioned, and because his family's from Gujarat, he didn't really understand anything. So here's me, like technically Pakistani, and he's technically Indian, but we're in India, and I'm more comfortable with this language
Wow.
here than he is. And I thought that was, really interesting. It tells you quite a lot about how much regional variation I think there is in these sort of massive places.
Mm-hmm.
So I've started learning a bit, but I want to do more. No one really in my immediate family wrote or read Urdu Punjabi, so it was all kind of conversational. I'd like to get to that, at least a conversational standard, especially because I was in Florida recently where three of my siblings live, and spent a bit of time with my nephew and niece, so Caleb and Charlotte. So they're 8 and 9. And in Urdu and Punjabi, you have different words depending on whether it's your uncle or aunt from your mother's side or your father's side, whether it's your let's say your dad's older brother or his younger brother.
Mm-hmm.
So I was teaching some of that, which they were kind of semi intrigued but a bit confused by. I think it kind of hit home that, like it's an amazing thing to share, and my language needs to be better so I can share it.
Yeah.
So, I think as much as I see it as something for me, I think it's also about having something to share as well.
Hmm. What are those words that make the different from the on side, uncle side? Um,
So my mum's brother is my mamu,
Mamu.
and then so my younger brother Zayn. So there's a middle brother Baba. So he's the one with the children. So Zayn is Caleb and Charlotte's chacha, and I'm their Daya, which is
Wow.
your dad's older one.
Yeah. Oh,
And then my mum's sisters are my colors, and then on my dad's side there'd be a puppo.
this is so cool.
And you also get a nani and a daddy as well, which is on your dad's side,
Oh,
your
that
grandma.
is so cool. I had no idea. Okay.
So you get a roadmap,
Yeah.
and then also with Len with a lot of ethnic families. Anyone old who you don't know is just using English word uncle or auntie.
Mm.
you know.
So tell me about how, and obviously as you've, your words, you've said this is, complicated your relationship to the language and the culture and the your heritage, which it's not complicated. It's you, it's who you are, and
Mm.
we celebrate that. But tell me how that and reflecting on your upbringing, your family, your lineage. Tell us how that translates into the work that you do and how you've been able to make that part of you not accessible to other people, but how you've made it into what you do for work.
Um, so I guess probably the best way of answering is explaining what I used to do for work, which kind of brought me here. So um, going back to that education point, I went down a very standard middle class white route, basically. I did school, did college, I became a lawyer, had heaps of debt, and I started at this big law firm, just after the financial crash, and we had riots in London in 2011. So a black man called Mark Duggan was shot in North London by police, and in an area where there has been, a real history of oppressive police behaviour towards the black community in that. So at a time of enforced austerity around the UK, as there were in lots of countries, we also had the shooting, and there were a lot of protests that kicked off in the area. Those protests then kind of expanded, and there was some rioting and looting over a few days. And I was in this sort of surreal 23rd floor of this like glass office law firm, looking at bits of London on fire. And I heard these people talk about these communities that were just like mine.
Mm,
And it was a real switch for me of, rather than thinking, as we're often encouraged to do, I think, as like minorities, of look how I've made it, I'm now in the thingy. You just pull yourself up the bootstraps, you can too. Like, that's what
yeah,
everyone's looking for.
right.
I was like, well, no, hang on a minute. Like, no. Um, and so that took me down a route where I kind of needed that commercial work because I needed to pay back loans and stuff.
Of course.
But I set up a not for profit called Apples and Pears, which really, in its most simplistic, organized trips for families at the weekends to explore London. But we'd use that to tackle whatever issue or topic that the community wanted to engage with. So, for example, if you had a lot of refugees moving to a particular area, we'd pair them up with a local family, and over a year they'd get to know London, learn how the public transport works, share culture, those kinds of things. We had a domestic violence program as well. We had one for neurodiverse children as well, where you could explore kind of more sort of spatial and fun activities at the weekend. So the idea was kind of tailoring. But the other side of it was really around volunteering, because one thing that became apparent to me with these communities was that we talk a lot about integration when we talk about migrants,
Hmm.
we don't talk about it so much when we're talking about middle class college grads moving and gentrifying an area in places like London and New York, staying there for 2 years, flipping a flat apartment, and then moving away.
Right.
So part of the volunteering was I wanted to connect people that are working in these sorts of office blocks to their local community as well, and engage with them, and then use your local butcher, and engage in that kind of community aspect of it, and not just be someone who comes here to work for a little bit and then leaves.
Hmm.
It opened up a lot for me in terms of this was all in East and South London, but in communities that were very similar to Southall. And as it was a really nice way of me seeing communities that were similar to mine. Now, a lot of those were Bangladeshi, some were Afro-Caribbean, some were Polish, but they're facing all sorts of similar issues that the generations before me in Southall had experienced.
Hmm.
And also, it was kind of interesting in that Southall now has a gentrification issue, and here I am, someone from there, being a gentrification issue in Southall. So how do you kind of connect to that? And it really started this process of looking back into my heritage, but I think also how certain issues, whether it's gentrification, whether it's austerity, are compounded based on things like race and gender, along with being working class communities as well in those areas. And I learned a lot from the families we work with.
Hmm.
And one thing that really set the tone was this notion of sort of 0 hours contracts.
Okay.
So people basically permanent freelancers, or I guess what you call 1099
Yeah.
workers in the States.
Yeah.
So no benefits of any kind. You don't get paid unless you're there. And we're all going through a process in urban areas of London where families, working class families, are being moved out into other areas, but their children were at the same school. So the parent has a choice of being late for work where they don't get paid unless they're there,
Mm.
or putting their 6-year-old on 2 or 3 buses to then get into school. And you see all these things compounding. And even with the apples and pears trips, they were completely paid for by the volunteers, guidance, school staff would come. But for some of the parents, particularly if you're working Uber or something, it still wasn't doable because you lose earnings at that time, and costs were flying up, for those communities a lot. So um, I think it recentered my efforts that I want to be doing work that was supporting communities more in that space than my other work. So I kind of had a deal with myself that as soon as I was debt free, I would resign and you know start up a social enterprise. And so that time came in February 2020, and I resigned at work and took a bit of time out to have a think what was next. And this coincided with beginning to look at my heritage languages again. I was doing some business style studying and really having a think about what I would do. And I really sort of opened up this relationship with language learning platforms.
Hmm.
So I started using a couple to explore my heritage languages, but also to brush up on my Spanish and other places I was moving to. And I just saw this pattern of this, again, Uber style relationship that I was very familiar with back in London, of people only really getting paid when they work, but also that pay declining, really high commission. Because if you think about it, if you go on, a one-on-one teaching platform and you have a teacher lined up for 3 weeks, you're pretty mean if you don't give them 5 stars. So
Mm.
most people have 5-star reviews, which means it's so hard for a student to figure out who to connect
Right.
with, but also
Yeah.
for a teacher to differentiate themselves beyond price. So we've just seen prices dropping and dropping. So I wanted to build something that allowed human beings to be centered, where they could earn and live well, but also then connecting to, I guess, my experience in terms of being somewhere people could practice. Because I was thinking again, like in reality, I never would have practiced with my cousins because I was too shy. So
Mm.
what I needed, one-on-one is great to kind of get you to a certain point, but actually you want conversation partners.
Yeah.
And the rarer the language, the harder it is to find that. And this opened up this world of language rights for me. So
Mhm.
I went on this sort of exploration of looking at all these fantastic projects around the world, trying to revitalize languages. And I think we've got something like 7,000 languages in the world. And according to the UN, around 40% of those are going to disappear over the next 80, 100 years. So a lot of those languages haven't made it onto digital. And, coming back to your point around feelings and expression, I was like, hang on, we aren't just losing languages here, we're losing concepts
Mm.
and ways of looking at the world. And what I wanted to do was kind of bring all of that and my offline community organizing into a new project, which is what I've recently started. So it's a social enterprise called Somos.
Somos.
And the goals are, it's, I guess, a triple mission, which is especially what you're not told to do for a tech startup, but I'm doing it anyway, is to create an environment for teachers to earn and live well, for language education to be accessible to all, and to ensure language rights for everybody.
Mm.
So those goals are kind of designing the language learning product. And what I've got at the moment is a 4-week conversation course led by a teacher once a week. So they don't have to do quite as much teaching, but then peer-to-peer learning groups for students to practice. So the idea being that it's cheaper for them per session,
Yeah.
so that rarer languages aren't priced out.
Mm.
Because I lived in Mexico for a little bit, and let's say you're Zapotec and you want to learn Zapotec in Mexico at $15 an hour for one-on-one. I mean, that's just not going to happen.
Mm.
So I was aiming for something that works out around $2 a session across the 4-week course. So hoping that it allows for more people to kind of engage with the product.
Yeah. I think that's wonderful. Please let us know how we can find Somos and how we can engage and how we can support you.
Um, so the website is somos.education, where you can
Mm-hmm.
find out about the courses, see our teachers, find out a bit more about our languages. But I think in terms of support, I think the first thing is please support the teachers. So one slightly funky thing we're doing at Somos, a bit different to other platforms, is most most platforms allow you to promote what you sell on that site as a teacher. So here's my one-on-one teaching profile, or here's my this. We've created a system that's a little bit like link in bio, in that their profiles for teachers to share all the many different ways that they engage with their students, whether that's Somos or not. So the first thing I'd say is please support them, because I think it's tough to be a content creator, I think, in this kind of space.
Yeah.
And for most of us that learn languages, we actually need loads of different ways. We need some one-on-one, we need some podcasts, we need a bit of app work. So I think it's natural that teachers actually teach across several different platforms, and maybe they do want to sell an ebook and have a podcast. So regardless of whether they use Somos or not, kind of want to promote that. I think the second thing is there are more projects than I can count that are doing amazing language revitalization work. We are kicking off a Projects We Love series, where once a month in the blog we will share projects of that nature and divert people to those. If you're passionate about your language, or a language you're learning, or a project you're familiar with, please let us know, because we'd love to feature that. And then of course there's coming to learn a course as well. I do really want it to be a space for mixed and Creole languages as well. And the real focus at Somos is not less that kind of scholastic stuff, but more about going from decent conversation to being confident. So if there's a language you'd like to learn, let us know and we'll try and find the teachers. Or if there's a teacher you think is fantastic, that is, because often so many teachers with those languages are doing it for free.
Mm.
Let us know, and hopefully we can kind of get them set up on the platform.
Yeah. I will share the information that you just shared. I'll put it in the show notes for this episode so that people
Oh, thank
can,
you.
yeah, we want people to click and find you right away. Kava, my friend, thank you. Thank you for
Thank
this
you.
conversation. I've really enjoyed talking with you and learning about what you do, learning about your life, hearing your story. Thank you for sharing. It's been wonderful. It's been a wonderful conversation.
No, thank you. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah. I like to ask the same question at the end of every episode. And if you can answer it, you are welcome to answer it. And if you have something else you'd like to substitute, please feel free to do so. The question is, do you have any jokes, popular sayings, tongue twisters, cool slang words, idioms, words of wisdom, or words of advice in Punjabi, Urdu, or
Ooh.
Swahili to share?
But in all honesty, my
Hmm.
spoken version of those languages probably isn't good enough to do that.
Okay.
But, and this is without making my grandmother or mum sound like enforcers, I think Punjabi and Urdu terms, in terms of instruction, a lot of the time. So my inner voice, when you've hit the snooze button too many times to like get up, that happens in Punjabi. Or if I'm in a rush, I have this like hybrid English Punjabi instruction going on in my head. And I don't know whether that's just falling back to the time when I was being yelled at as a child,
Oh
or
no.
whether it's just because that feels natural and that's as far as I can take it.
Mm.
So they're a bit boring in that sense. It's a bit like,
No,
wake
no.
up quickly, get up, and like, so yeah, I guess I think so. It's not really quite good enough to tell a joke, unfortunately.
It's okay. It's okay. How about since you do speak other languages, let's open that up to any other languages. Any favorite words that you have or any favorite phrases that you've learned in any of the languages that you've picked up?
Well, I obviously like Somos because I took that from Spanish to label the business, which I really like. My gran used to say, so I don't know if you've heard the phrase like "joldi joldi" for like quickly, and then she'd clap her hands and go "fata fata," and I don't know if that means anything, but that was like serious.
Mm.
So like, move it quickly.
Well, Kava, thank you so much. And before I let you go, in this situation, after you've been talking to someone for quite some time in any language, doesn't matter which one, whichever comes to mind first, what is the best way to say goodbye?
Also, I like saying to the artist, which is what growing up my family would have said, which is like the Urdu way of saying goodbye. Yeah, because that would my nanny would hang up the phone saying that, and I'd speak to her. And my mum still says that, so it's
Yeah.
nice.
Can you repeat it one more time?
Kudafis.
Khadafis, Khadafis, Kava. Thank you again for
Kudafis.
this conversation, and I'll be talking to you soon.
Great. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.